In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now, with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. This is your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm Chris Bair. Thank you for joining us on this brisk, cold Saturday morning. And today, my guest, once again, is Mr. Josh Erickson. Josh, thanks for joining us here this morning.
It's always kind of fun to get out from behind the cameras and actually sit and talk about this stuff, especially because I'm kind of a nerd about history. So, no, I enjoy it.
History is a lot of fun, and hence that's why we have the radio show, The Legacy of Agriculture, is we have the opportunity to talk about the past and the present, and sometimes we even get to talk about the future. But you know, Josh, it's fall, and believe it or not, harvest is almost over. In June and July, we had all those torrential, record-breaking rainfalls that we thought, the sky's falling, we're never going to have a crop. And as I would say in the last 2 weeks, working for Pfeiffer's, I've probably put on about 2,000 miles or so on my pickup. The fall harvest is almost done. I have been clear across the state of South Dakota. I've been to Iowa. Yesterday, Kyle was down in Nebraska, and the harvest is almost done. And what's more remarkable is that Pfeiffer's in the month of October will have conducted over 50 land auctions in the upper Midwest from one end of the country to the other.
It's pretty amazing to see, and we did a project here south of the office, me and the other gentleman who help work in the yard, who do just a fantastic job down there. And we were driving past. It was about 30-minute drive from the shop, and it was absolutely amazing to see just people moving and shaking in the field. I mean, you would have trucks cycling through these fields. You would have these tractors going, all hours of the day. And I know I've got relatives who farm, and it's pretty well into the night that they seem to be doing harvest season. So it's always fun that time of year. It's fun to talk to the people who are doing it because you kind of catch them in the middle of something. Hey, I'm busy. I got 5 minutes. What do you need? That kind of stuff. But it's really, really great to see. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later in the episode about some of that industriousness in our country. And it's truly amazing.
On this episode of the Legacy of Agriculture, now that we got all that out of the way, Josh, right? We're going to talk about settlements in the United States and how this country was being settled back in the 1800s, and just a brisk topic about how people stayed alive and how they lived back in the 1800s. As I read about history, and I one of my favorite things to do is to go on. We always call it a field trip, right? Because when you're a little kid in school, you always went on a field trip. If I ever stop, for example, just south of us on I-29 is the Lewis and Clark Museum that where Lewis and Clark wintered on the Missouri River, and so there's rich Lewis and Clark history here in the Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota corner down in the Sioux City area about Lewis and Clark and them wintering, and it's amazing to me how tough the people were back in the 1800s. They were just tough.
Yeah, it's something else to see, and the problems that they face and some of the problems we're going to discuss today were things that they were wholly unprepared for. I mean, there's no guidebook for settling on the prairie, right? You have no idea the kind of weather patterns you're facing. You have no idea the kind of farming issues that you're facing. Nowadays, if we want to know the weather, we pull out our handy-dandy smartphone and we look up what it's going to be this weekend, right? Back then, you hoped that it wasn't a blizzard, and then you found a way to get through if it was. And I think that's pretty amazing, and I think that determination is one of the best qualities about living in this part of the world. Is I find that speaking with people who are ultimately descendants of the folks who moved westward, you can see it. You talk with folks in agriculture today, as well as other industries, and they've got a kind of swagger about them in this part of the world where it's, I might not understand this, I might not know the best way to do this, but I'm going to find a way through. And that is amazing to see. I think that's part of our heritage.
Well, one of my most favorite uh, Legacy of Agriculture podcasts was when I did an interview with Jerry Oster, and he talked about the history of WNX. I mean, the AM radio station that we're broadcasting on over 100 years ago was started partially on the premise of getting weather forecasting and major weather events out to people. All they had was an AM radio, and that was already into the 1900s. We're going to talk a lot about the 1800s where there was just nothing. So when a tornado hits, and a lot of times you don't have a warning.
Yeah,
You head for the potato cellar.
And it is something else to see the kind of things that people dealt with, but also the kind of people who moved out here, and right, the kind of people who survived out here. And I think it's interesting to look at why some did and some didn't, because I believe the statistic I read, and I may have this wrong, but I believe it was only about 40% of the people who homesteaded actually made it, right? So less than half the people who moved out across the country actually survived on this new land. And I think that's fascinating because it's not something, success is not guaranteed, right? It's the kind of thing that a lot of people are pinning their hopes on, and a lot of people are failing. And yeah, it's really fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, and it's just absolutely fun to talk about. So as we are talking about settlements in the 1800s and into the 1900s, there was a lot of advances that got made from 1800 to 1900. We were a relatively new country. There were settlers and immigrants that were coming by the shipload from all over the world into this new world, into the United States. And there wasn't just houses and apartment complexes to move into. There wasn't places for them to live, and so they had to make do with what they had when they got to landfall. But here in just a few minutes, we're going to be back. We're going to take a commercial break. I appreciate Josh Erickson from Pfeiffer Auction Realty for joining us here on the Legacy of Agriculture this morning, and we're going to get into a deep dive into settling America between 1800 and into the 1900s, and we're going to be back in just a few minutes. Hang on.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Folks, we're back. I'm Chris Bair, the host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning. If you missed the radio show on WNX Radio, you can join us on Apple, Spotify, and now on YouTube. We've had great success on the YouTube channel as we've migrated and kind of increasing our footprint. Josh has been very instrumental in helping Legacy of Agriculture get to that point. So, Josh, tell us a little bit about the research that you've done about settling and migration from 1800 to 1900.
Yeah, so I think that one of the fun parts about history is you have to pick out your stopping point, right? Because as you go back, if you look at this event is affected by an event prior. Well, that event prior is affected by an event prior, which is affected by an event prior, and it's
Right.
turtles all the way down, right? So I think that a good stopping point is about the 1800s. You mentioned America, the United States of America was a relatively new nation, and even as it's establishing itself, pretty much from the get-go, there's the idea of the West as the place to go when you want opportunity, right? So the West takes on this sort of mythology even from a very early stage, and that's when the West is just west of the mountains, right? It's before you even hit the prairie, before you hit Minnesota, the Dakotas, the Nebraskas, and even further into Colorado, into Wyoming. So there's already.
Well, really, to be honest with you, Josh, back in that period of time, before the Louisiana Purchase, anything that was west of the Missouri River was the Wild West. I mean, yes, the Mississippi River was kind of a dividing line, and then as more and more people came, it moved over to the Missouri River, and those were the stopping points back then.
Yeah, and it's like a boundary line of where civilization is and isn't, and where the opportunity to move civilization is. And so yeah, it's really cool to look at. One of the things that drives a lot of that westward expansion, and kind of a way that I like to conceptualize it, is three separate worlds, right? We all live in one world and we all affect each other, but for the sake of this discussion, you kind of have your old European world, right? This is England and France and Spain. This is where a lot of our ancestors are coming from before they come to the United States. And that's what I would consider your second world, is the settled United States, which at the early 1800s is along the coastline, starting that push westward, but it's not very far. You look at the original 13 colonies compared to today, there's not a lot of landmass there.
There wasn't.
And so then the final world that I want to kind of consider is what at the time was Native American controlled land, right? And how those worlds interact. A lot of it starts in Europe. A lot of immigration in America starts in Europe, because you have all of these families, and Europe had these traditions at the time where you would inherit things if you were the oldest. So if you, Chris Bair, is the oldest son, you might get your dad's land, your dad's cattle, your dad's, horses, no tractors at that time. But you might get it all, and then your younger brother would get absolutely nothing. So he's sitting there out on the street, or maybe working in a city in just a nowhere job, and he thinks, man, this is just awful. So he hops on a boat, which is full of people, and it's dirty and it's stinky and it's loud and you're getting seasick, and all of his hopes are on, yeah, this is just awful, but somewhere over the sea is going to be a better life. Somewhere over there is going to be something that I can work and I can build with my own two hands. And so that's where a lot of these immigrants, they hitch their hopes and dreams on. Same kind of thing you see immigration with today. So a lot of people, they want the American dream, the idea that you can do something for yourself. And so they get into this new world, and what they find is that a fair amount of the coast is already pretty similar to Europe. I mean, we've got cities like Boston that have been established for hundreds of years at this point. They have their own traditions and cultures and high societies and people who stick their nose up at you because you don't own property, right? And all of those things that people get self-conscious about that they were trying to escape is still here. And so as people move over, maybe they find good jobs in the cities, or maybe jobs are a little more scarce. And they hear about this kind of myth, this idea of, well, the West is where to be. If you're sitting on the coast, if you're in New York City, you're like, man, I don't know. This place is dirty. It's crowded. I don't know if I'm going to make it here, but I hear over the mountains is a place where there's wide open land, where you can farm, you can plow the ground, and you can see the wonders of God's creation.
Or there's gold, or there's silver, or there's ore, or there's look what the Rocky Mountains did for precious metals.
Exactly. And the miners are the people who drive the first wave of Western expansion, and that you'll see that episode, miners moving across the mountains, repeated over and over during Western expansion, and then other people following, right? People selling them things like shovels and pickaxes, and then farmers, and it's
the opportunity for trade.
Yeah, and so it's a huge driving force. And as they're moving across westward, right, we'll start with our miners as they move over the mountains. What they encounter is that this isn't some new world. There's people who have lived there for thousands upon thousands of years. There's tribes that have, traditionally considered this land their land. And so
talking about Native Americans.
Yeah, yes, sir. And so that leads to some conflict and some misunderstandings and all of that comes with it. So these worlds are interacting and they're influencing each other, because as people are moving westward and encountering different tribes, they're sending back stories. And I mean, we know from the news today what sells: sensationalism, right? So, oh my goodness, the sky is falling and all these people are all the worst because of this, that, and the other thing. That's what's going to sell newspapers. So that's what's going to get printed, whether or not it's true, which is affecting relationships between the worlds. Yeah, it really is interesting how there's almost a dialogue that goes on between the three of them at any given point in westward expansion. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I've had a brain fart. I've lost my train of thought. I had a point where I was going with that, and I think I might have lost.
Yeah, but you were during that period of time, though, as settlers were moving across the United States, the amount of conflict between the white man and the Native Americans was substantial, because you had a federal government that was saying, "Hey, you come out here into the Midwest, or you come out west of the Missouri River, even west of the Mississippi River, we're going to give you 160 acres of ground, or we're going to give you 320 acres of ground." And the Native Americans are sitting here going, "Wait a second, we've been here forever, and now we have a new government that's giving away our land." And so you had that conflict going on already.
And a question of land ownership, right? The Louisiana Purchase is a really fun one. The Louisiana Purchase is where, I mean, I currently live in South Dakota. I am a part of that area of land that was sold. That was bought from the old European continent, from a French claim, because Napoleon at the time, our favorite Frenchman, needed money to wage wars. So he's got this huge claim in the Americas, and he says, "I don't care about that. I'm trying to figure out how to feed my people," right? There's no need for us to own this much land in the Americas. So he sells it to the President of the United States for pennies on the dollar, right? I mean, it is cheap.
It was
land.
like a penny an acre or some
I can't
crazy.
remember the exact number, but I remembered the first time I heard it, I was like, oh my goodness, I wish that I could be able to purchase
This is where you get your checkbook out, right?
Yeah, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I'll take it at that number. You tell me where. But you know, so the president buys this land, and here's the question: the French sold him the land. How do the French own that land? They just said that they owned it. Like, that's fascinating to me. They're like, yeah, no, actually, our government.
I'll bet you there's history behind that.
There is.
There's got to be history.
They explored it and staked claims to it, and so that's what was allowed. But you know, claim is only as good as what you can control, and so the French have no real control here, and they sell it to the Americans.
It's kind of like, if you don't believe me that I own this land, I'll just kill you, right?
Yeah, and that's what's great. It's like it's selling someone else's car out from under them, you know, and that's a large part of this process, and a large part of the conflict is you run into these Native American tribes, and all these settlers are like, no, you don't understand. I bought this land. I worked hard for this money. I saved up. I scrimped and saved. I moved my family out here so that I could achieve this dream, and I've staked everything on it. And all of the people living there go, that's great, but you bought it from someone who bought it from someone who bought it from someone who didn't really own it. Yeah. And so it's a massive amount of miscommunication. And it keeps going. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna take a commercial break, Josh. We're gonna be right back with more of the legacy of agriculture.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffers. Nobody does it better.
We're back with I'm Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us on the Legacy of Agriculture. Josh Erickson, historian, has joined us, and we're talking about settlements in the 18 all throughout the 1800s. I almost feel like I'm in politics because I keep stumbling over my words this morning. A little bit of stumbling because I'm not really sure how to answer the questions.
Oh, yep. I've had those days. Trust me.
A little bit of shuck and jive. So anyways, Josh, we were talking about during the break, we were talking about the Homestead Act and the westward movement. We had We had people that were migrating from the East Coast clear to the West Coast for gold. The California gold rush was going on. You had people that were moving, just trying to stake a claim and have a piece of America. They wanted the freedoms that we had. They wanted what we had. You had religious movements of people moving clear across the United States for religious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
You had all kinds of things that were going on that were causing people to crisscross the greatest nation in the world for all kinds of different reasons. And you had all this space in between. And then you had the railroads coming, and you had all this. But let's talk about the Homestead Act and how the Homestead Act affected growth and agriculture.
Yeah, yeah. And so people are already moving across, whether this act is in place or not. That's very important because the Homestead Act streamlines the process, but it does not start the process. So you already got people, and a great example of this is actually Texas. The United States government told people, hey, don't settle in Texas. And a bunch of people went, yeah, that's cool. We love that idea, but we're going to still do what we want. And so that's still happening all throughout the West.
That sounds like employees.
Oh yeah.
You tell them to do something, they go, "Oh, we're going to go do that."
You wouldn't know anything about that.
You don't know.
Yeah.
I don't. I got nothing.
So no, it's interesting because this is already happening, and the debate for the Homestead Act begins well before the Civil War, because you have all this land that's now purchased through the Louisiana Purchase. How do we handle it? How do we process it? And we say settle it, right? But ultimately it's a colonial project. How do we colonize it, right? And calling a spade is important. And so the United States government has all of these debates, usually along party lines, because of certain rules and compromises in the Constitution about admitting slave states, right? So anytime a slave state is admitted into the Union, a free state has to be admitted into the Union, and vice versa, so that the South of the United States wanted to keep their level of power, the North wanted to keep their level of power, and there's different lobbying groups for both abolition and retaining slavery. And so that's a large portion and a large driver of why it takes so long to start drawing lines on the map, because it seems like that's something that everybody wants to do, but they can't figure out a way to compromise to do it, right? Well, in the 1860s, there is an event that is semi-famous in world history, which is the American Civil War. And no matter what people say, the American Civil War is ultimately fought over the question of slavery, right? Some people say it's states' rights. It is ultimately the question of the states' rights at that time was the right to own other human beings. And it's important to talk about that. So the Civil War kicks off, and there's fighting all across the country. It seems like it's ripping itself apart over this question that is just abhorrent. And people are taking up arms against their family members in order to try and settle this question, because they can't seem to find a way to do it civilly. And so they start this fighting, and what happens is all these states in the South secede. When they secede, their votes leave with them. So Congress, which was at the time this debate of two different political parties that are kind of tug of war back and forth between this idea of how to admit states, all of a sudden, one side lets go of the rope. You can do whatever you want. You have the majority vote. So the North passes the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act lays out how much land is going to be allotted to farmers, how long they have to stay on the land, and the fact that all of these homesteads are for people who are loyal to the United States and people who are willing to move into this new area, and they aren't going to be slave states because that's already been decided by them. So they kind of seize the moral high ground, they encourage loyalty, and they try and move people into these new areas while they've got the majority vote. And it works. So people start moving to the West in droves, and that act stays in place after the war ends, after the South is kind of brought back into the fold, and Reconstruction era begins. This Homestead Act, which was passed ultimately with very, very little debate, because half of the country said they weren't part of the country anymore, it stays in place.
They want us to succeed is what they
Mhm.
want to do. They want to create another nation.
And so they no longer get a say in what happens in this nation,
Right.
right? And that's ultimately what happens. And so these new states that are admitted are not slave states, right? Because slavery in the North is abolished, and then after the South is brought to heel, it's abolished in the South. And so you have all of these people in the South, all of these now freed Black Americans who are granted citizenship, but they're in these places where they still don't have anybody who will really advocate for them. The people in the North are kind of tired of fighting for them. They just want the war to be over. And so this Homestead Act provides a unique opportunity for Black Americans that they can move westward. And so there's different land areas that are granted specifically to Black Americans. And
Well, not only that, but they have the opportunity to go from the South to the North and join up with the Industrial Revolution following the Civil War.
exactly. And so all of these, it creates this massive migration of people. And when people move, when people rub elbows, there's conflict. And so some of this move westward leads to a lot of the miscommunications and the fighting that we talked about in our last segment. And the majority of it is, if you look at the history of these conflicts, there's a lot of good people trying to keep them from happening. And there's a lot of people who just don't understand what's going on, and they're making mistakes. And so I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for all sides who are going through this time period because, again, they're facing challenges they are not prepared for, and they have to just find a way to deal with it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, hey, folks, we're coming down to the end of our third segment. I appreciate Josh Erickson for joining us. We're going to be back into our fourth segment in just a few minutes. If you're wondering what the Pfeiffer's team has got going on this fall in 2024 into early winter, you'll want to go to their website at pfeifers.com or simply call us at the Southern Dakota facility just south of Sioux Falls, 605-836-2277. Nobody does it better.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeifers. Nobody does it better.
Hey, everybody, we're back. I'm Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture, in our fourth and final segment. This radio show is really interesting because we're cruising along and all of a sudden we're out of time. We're into our fourth segment. So you talked a lot about the Homestead Act in our third segment. So let's move ahead to some of the current things that are going on, Josh.
Yeah, and I do find it fun to be on this radio show. I'm a bit of a chatterbox for those of you who can't tell by now.
Yeah, but you just got to tell me a couple weeks ago you don't like to do it because we talk about machinery.
Oh yeah, so I get excited when we can talk about it.
And to be fair, I'm going to air some of your dirty laundry.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Josh came to work for Pfeiffer's 3-4 years ago?
3 or 4 years, something like that.
All city kid.
Yeah.
Never been on the seat of a tractor. Didn't know anything about it. And now we're turning him into a country boy. As a matter of fact, part of your PTO you took last week, you went up to your land up in Minnesota. And just took a couple of days off and
tried to be away from the city. Yeah.
And tried to be away from the city. So are we being a good influence or a bad influence?
Oh, jury's still out on that one. But yeah. No, and I got to say, you'd mentioned
now your mom says that we're a terrible influence on you.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. But, I think it's fun. I will say, you mentioned our sponsor. And so Pfeiffer's, I do some work for you down in the yard there. So if you guys find this interesting, you're welcome to stop by. I could always use an excuse to try and shirk work and talk history. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's what lunch hour's for.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So as we kind of move into the future, one of the things that's fascinating to me about history, and there's a lot of debate on why people do it. And I've actually been reading quite a few books lately on the whole purpose of history as a practice, right? Why do people write down what people have done? And one of the things is that it's a very hopeful exercise, right? This idea that if we look at the past, there is something there that's worth knowing. And that means that it's a dialogue, right? Something in our present moment needs some lesson that happened a while ago, and that's what helps progress and helps push humanity forward.
We always repeat history.
Yeah, and so we try and do it a little bit better this time. And so one of the lessons that I carry out of this very tumultuous time period is that all of the people going through it, there's such a lack of knowledge, right? You look at education levels at this time period. Nowadays, it's common for any job to ask for a bachelor's degree, and that's pretty ridiculous considering that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that was what like the top tier of society had achieved, right? Nowadays, it's pretty common for someone to be college educated. And so the reason I bring that up is the fact that all of these problems that they're facing are things that they don't know how to handle, and that the only way that they can move forward through blizzards, through dusty soil, through dirt sod houses that are just, I mean, they're nothing. They're the definition of poverty. The only way that people can move forward through that is by doing their best to endure. And that's for all three of those worlds we talked about, right? People moving in from Europe and getting off the boat and finding that the central area of America is maybe not what they hoped for. They've got to find a new solution. The people in
And it's pretty tough to go back once you got here.
It is trying to get back on the boat to go the other way. Oh man, I couldn't imagine that. And the the people who were in the Americas at the time, but who were becoming disenfranchised with city life, right? They had to have a tremendous amount of hope in something like the Homestead Act that this land could be better. And the people who are currently living on that land, as they go through some of these really just horrendous events, things that I couldn't imagine living through, they have to have an incredible amount of hope to preserve their unique culture and their unique language. That's something that's very important to the South Dakota tribes. And I think it's fascinating that people ultimately, they find ways to keep going. And I think in our present moment, we've got an election season coming up, which is a very hot button issue on any type of show. But the legacy of agriculture is ultimately an apolitical entity, right? We don't believe in telling you who you should vote for, but we do believe you should get out and vote, and that you should be an educated voter. And so as you face these big problems, as we face these big problems, there's things that we have to handle, like the advancement of smartphones. I was talking with my dad about this. I have never grown up in a world, I can't remember a world where anything I do couldn't be photographed and shared with millions of people in an instant. And that's something some of our older listeners maybe don't, they remember what it was like where all of a sudden your world was small, and my world is big. It's very connected. And so that is an issue that I have to face. The type of political discourse that we face, this side is bad and this side is bad and you're bad for liking them or you're bad for liking them, those are complicated issues. And the way through them, I think, especially since we don't have a great roadmap for how to navigate some of these, is to try and listen more, try and be more educated. So the goal of our radio show is to decide which stories are important to share and which stories are important to preserve. I think that ultimately that's a collaborative act, right? Our listeners, you who are on the other side of the radio or on the other side of the computer screen watching on YouTube or listening on podcasts, you have to find out what's important from the past and what lessons you can take from it. And then ultimately history is about sharing it, right? You have to find a way to spread that around.
Sharing it accurately.
Yes, and to...
And completely. Tell the whole story.
Not just the parts that you like. And I think I think that we've made leaps and bounds in the last 100 years on how we talk about things. And in some ways, if you look at the news media, we've taken steps back. So I would encourage just everybody who's listening, if this is stuff that you find fascinating, right? Listening to how people survived, you're going through those same times. There are going to be things 200 years from now that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will go, wow, how did they make it through this unregulated time of the internet where any kind of piece of information was just right at your fingertips? How'd they survive that? Or how did they survive all of these current hot-button political issues where it seems like nobody knows how to listen anymore and everybody's terribly rude to each other? And I think that the best of us, when we are the best, is when we're we're kind to each other and when we're listening to each other. And that's how that community is how people survived on the prairie too, when they helped their neighbor.
With just a little over a minute left in this segment, about a minute and 30 seconds left in this segment, Josh, in your opinion, what do you think is the biggest difference from people in the 1800s to date, and what do you think that is similar? And both loaded questions.
Oh yeah, and I could talk for hours upon hours, but ultimately there's only one difference I see, which is circumstance. If you take someone born in the 1800s and plop them right down in the 2020s, eventually they would adapt, right? We love the idea of, right, unfreezing the caveman. Look at how amazing the world is. But people are people, you know? Right. I think that they're the same, and I think the things that matter to us, caring for one another, loving one another, helping one another, being useful to one another, those were important then, and they're important now. And there's people out there who will tell you differently, but ultimately it's a lie. And building a community of people who care about you and who you care about, that's something that's essential to the human experience. That's something true throughout all of history. So the problems that they face, the problems that we face are unique problems, but our ability to get through them, our ability to problem solve, and our ability to help uplift one another as we do so, that's something that's timeless.
Well, Josh, thank you very much for joining us on the Legacy of Agriculture. A huge shout out and a thank you to Pifer Auction Realty and Land Management for sponsoring the Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate everyone for joining us. Without our listeners, we couldn't have this show. Join us next week.
In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna been on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pifer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pifer's at 605-836-2277.